Revolution is not an apple that falls when it's ripe. You have to make it fall. And even if you can't reach the apple, Mother Nature created wind to help give you a chance. Most people dream of getting the apple, but not many think about what happens after. As we fall deeper into the last saga, we start getting closer to the core concepts that Oda seems to be highlighting with his story. There are certain seeds he has planted since the beginning of the series that feel like they are about to bloom, and the biggest question is what kind of fruit will each seed grow into? And I think one of the biggest mysteries lie within the Revolutionary Army. Recently we've gotten more information regarding their characters, hierarchy, formation, decision making, and their goals, but while we have so many parts, there still seems to be a huge disconnect in who the almost mystical leader is, and what he'll eventually provide the story with by the end of the last saga. Monkey D. Dragon is a character that I have been interested in for a long time now, so much so that my first theories were rooted in unraveling some of his mysteries. By now it's obvious that Oda has based this character in real life revolutionaries like Che Guevara, and that is something I'll deep dive at another time. What I want to focus on instead is how Oda gave us enough supporting evidence to predict what kind of role Dragon will play in the story and why he has been such a confusing character. And I think I finally cleared the fog of war and mystery, so if you're having trouble seeing the vision, let me help. The way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the Parvision. So I think it's no secret that most people believe that Dragon has to have a wind-related power. There's theories that he has a wind Logia power, which I personally do not like for a multitude of reasons, but after Greenbill's woods or forest Logia, Oda could give Dragon something like a storm Logia, which fits most of the motifs we have seen from Dragon, where when he has been activated, a storm also came in junction to him. And maybe we get bamboozled and Dragon ends up having some sort of really powerful paramecia. And while we can't completely discount that, it does seem the least likely given the story's emphasis on Logias, but also now the newly pristine level of power called Mythical Zoan. The kind of catch-all power that has made a lot of people tired of its existence given how random and convenient it can be. But on the other side, it can be interesting if done well as doing something that I personally love with One Piece, which is giving the story another connection to real-life lore to interact with Oda's master-crafted play, where he has many myths and legends around the world intertwined in this crazy pirate story. And so along with a proposed Mythical Zoan animal power that I think a lot of people land on some sort of serpentine bird that at the mythical level functions like a dragon that ultimately has rain powers or storm powers that are rooted in wind, which again works with One Piece given we have seen so many mythical Zoans display paramecia and or Logia like powers combined with an already insane power up that gets buffed when you take into account the awakening potential that essentially gives the characters full reign on the mythos of whatever animal they are, which we see with Kaido's dragon, but also Saint Saturn where his yokai Ushi-Oni transformation seems to give him much of the actual yokai's alleged abilities. And I want to address all of that because I also want to hit you with the reality that I have accepted in that the wind power seems to be an overall thematic within the Revolutionary Army. It doesn't seem to be a one-off attribute only given to Dragon. Instead, it seems like Oda has been using wind as a nuanced form of freedom, which is reflected in so many ways like how the characters operate, their backstories, and even their powers. And more than anything, I think this might be the most important clue to dissect. Now, it's not as linear as I'm making it sound, but first let's discuss the wind pattern. First off, like I said before, it's not just Dragon that has wind powers. In his founding members, we see separate to Ivankov's hormone fruit, Eva seems to have some sort of wind or air control with attacks like Hellwink. Various levels of this attack throughout the manga makes it more than clear that it functions just like pressurized air being blasted out. Then similarly, we see that the one offensive ability that Kuma has with his Pawpaw fruit is literally just compressed air into basically an air grenade, creating immense wind pressure. Then obviously we have Monkey D. Dragon, who very clearly used wind in his debut at Logtown, but I want to bring the focal point to the new chief of staff Sabo, who also has wind powers. As we see before he acquired the Mera Mera no Mi, he demonstrates the Dragon Claw Fist Dragon Breath technique that has a very interesting martial art palm technique. In the moment in Dressrosa, right before he destroyed the Colosseum with what was depicted to be wind, we see him use a core sensing ability, not too different from when Zoro was listening to the breath of all things in Alabasta. It seems like Sabo targeted the core and then exploded it with wind powers. And now I'm highlighting this because we know that Sabo was trained by the Revolutionary Army and namely Dragon. We know that in his adolescence with Ace and Luffy, he never had any abilities of the sort. But after his time in the Revolutionary Army, he comes out with a move like this. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that Dragon personally taught Sabo this attack. Given the name is a direct allusion to Dragon by it being called Dragon's Breath, and on top of it being wind related with breath aspect. And so the reason why this is important is because if if Dragon's power were devil fruit related, would it make sense for him to be able to teach this ability to Sabo? Have we seen someone with a devil fruit directly teach and impart their ability to a devil fruitless character? Acknowledging that we have Law and Luffy doing bonkers things with bonker fruits, mimicking Corazon and Ace respectively. But anyways, the point gets sealed even more when you realize Sabo also offered to impart the technique to Robin, who declined to learn the Dragon Claw Fist technique but did successfully use the core visualization aspect and demonstrate that despite not being a fisherman was able to perform fisherman karate. And so because of this, maybe there is more to Dragon's power than it's simply being devil fruit related, since it seems like he has some kind of knowledge that he has empowered his officers with. For more on that, you can check out my first theories on how Dragon and his army might be the ones to show us interesting forms of haki, which I'll update soon with more refined details. But even without all of that, there seems to be something core to not just Dragon, and that seems to apply to basically everyone, and that would be empowerment or support. Sabo is kind of an outlier, but I'll address that soon. If we understand that Ivankov said that the point of the Revolutionary Army was to essentially empower people to liberate themselves, and we recontextualize that to not just the mechanics of how the army operates, but also how they use their powers, a lot of things start making a lot more sense. See, a huge conundrum has been presented to us recently in our expectation of Dragon's power levels and the actions he has taken in the story. Even for people who had lower expectations of what he was capable of, still reasonably would be asking, well, if he had any form of power, why hasn't he used it at any junction of the story? From what the story has shown us so far, it always seems that his commanders are taking actions or making sacrifices. And while Oda has purposefully redacted any of the action from Dragon's influence on the story in a way not too dissimilar from Shanks prior to the last saga, now we have hit a part of the story where we are finding out what kind of punch these hidden characters pack. Characters like Shanks and Garp, Blackbeard and the Admirals, Kuma and the Revs, and even with all of that progression, we are still left at a dark standstill with Monkey D. Dragon. Unlike some other characters in the series, I personally think that we have some solid basis to at least expect an unfathomable amount of power from him. And yes, some of that comes from the fact that a lot of rumors say that the D clan is the one who brings the storm, and Dragon is basically always bringing a storm. He is the main protagonist's father and the hero of the Marine's son. He trained Sabo, who is now the Flame Emperor and is considerably strong, but also is at the helm of the only known operation in the One Piece verse that has a sole purpose to dismantle and destroy the status quo of the world government. And he has been doing this successfully for nearly 30 years. We have to recognize that whenever it comes to upsetting the balance of the world, that's when Luffy has faced the greatest resistance. At Enies Lobby, where he had to unlock Gear 2 and Gear 3 just to barely come out of the battle alive. And technically a Celestial Dragon pushed Luffy to debut Gear 4, but this power was born out of the recognition of the Marines as this tall, formidable wall that he had to overcome at Marineford. And finally, with the threat of upsetting the Yonko balance, another Cypher Pole agent was present, and he became a huge catalyst towards Luffy unlocking Gear 5. And somehow, ever since Dragon left the Navy, this has been his enemy. And they haven't even really been close to getting him since they only recently discovered his secret base in Baltigo. But personally, I think one of the greatest testaments to Dragon's power come from the people who sworn loyalty to him, Ivankov and Kuma specifically. Ivankov and Kuma are both characters that have witnessed the highest level of the world's oppressive natures. They were both present at God Valley to witness and actually participate in a cleansing event where they were being hunted down by holy knights, targeted by the Rock's crew, and Roger's crew is probably in the mix, and Kuma as a child actually technically fought with the Gorosei, something no other person probably can say they experienced. And though we have no knowledge of Dragon being present, he would have been 14 at the time of the event. We do see Garp, who reasonably doesn't bring his son there, but anyways, Ivankov and Kuma are not creditless characters. They actually have some of the most merit when it comes to freedom fighting, and that being said, despite their respective outcomes in life, ended up forever bending the knee to Dragon. When we look back at Impel Down and Marineford, every insane feat that Luffy pulls off when it comes to tenacity, strength, or leadership, Ivankov gives us a portrayal that it's reminiscent of Dragon, saying the line, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." And we have to keep in mind that this is an Ivankov that in a lot of ways was able to defeat Luffy at the time, mainly because Ivankov knows haki, but also Ivankov's subordinates Caroline was able to outpace Sanji in terms of strength and speed. Given how Ivankov was portrayed in the Kuma flashback as well, from multiple angles, I can't see Ivankov's trust in Dragon not being substantiated, and that's even more validated from the Kuma side, where Kuma literally saw hell and back, but to the end of his life still bet on Dragon and Dragon's son. But seeing the way Kuma saw camaraderie by the way he tested Zoro in Thriller Bark, he tested Zoro by seeing if he could withstand a portion of his captain's pain and suffering. And the overall understanding is that yes, Zoro withstood it within inches of his life, but that was what Luffy put himself through, selflessly every single fight in the past and even more so in the future. So was that a reflection of what Kuma felt about Dragon? Has Kuma felt Dragon's pain? It was after this test that Kuma declared Luffy's friends to be exceptional and then said, "He is your son after all, Dragon." When Kuma quantified Luffy's pain, saying it would probably knock himself out, maybe there was a time when Kuma had to extract Dragon's pain, and maybe by absorbing Dragon's pain is when he realized that Dragon was an unfathomable existence, much like what Ivankov saw in Luffy's tenacity throughout Marineford. Luffy nearly died 2 or 3 times over, but refused to, until he reached his goal, no matter what pain or suffering. And in that position, spectating Luffy, Ivankov took an important position, which was simply supporting Luffy. And that's how we come full circle. The modus operandi of the Revolutionary Army has always been to find the flame, the sparks of the revolution, and fan it until it becomes the wildfire that burns down the establishment. They have always been the pillars of support that a revolution needs, but not necessarily the revolution itself. We see that in chapter 1096, where after establishing the Revolutionary Army, they said their plan was to act like mercenaries and lend our strength to rebellious elements seeking to overthrow their kings. And I know a lot of this part sounds super obvious, and if you're familiar with a game like League of Legends, the next few assertions will be much easier to understand. But the specific thing is that unlike Luffy, who uses his strength to overthrow kings, the Revolutionary Army should be operating in a way where their strength is used by the people to liberate themselves. In that regard, the Revolutionary Army is a tool used to support those who want to find freedom themselves. And when we look at the Revolutionary Army, we see their powers reflect a lot of that. And the most significant example is Bello Betty, who has the Pump Pump fruit. Her power literally translates to encouragement. By encouraging people with words, she can increase someone's fighting spirit and physical strength. In gamer terms, this would be an offensive buff, increasing strength and to a certain extent, even speed. The assertion is that all of the Revolutionary Army is basically centralized around these support abilities. They can typically heal, protect, strengthen allies, weaken enemies, which that usually comes in the form of what is called crowd controls, which would be like stunning an opponent, freezing them, slowing them down, blinding them, or taking away their senses. Another aspect is transportation, so either speeding up people or straight up teleporting them. And finally, there is a support role that surrounds attacking, and usually it's pinpoint attacks, playing as a decoy, or executing to assist damage dealers. And I know a lot of this sounds kind of foreign to a normal One Piece discussion, but you could classify a lot of characters within these parameters. To a certain degree, you could fit most of Law's abilities within this section. He has a teleport that can aid his allies or disrupt his enemies. He has the ability to heal, he can silence, he has a crowd control in the form of final damage to opponents in the form of internal damage. I gave Law as an example because he would be what most gamers consider to be an overpowered support, which was largely his role on both Rooftops and Dressrosa against Doflamingo and in Onigashima against Kaido and Big Mom. And I think that foundation will be really valuable insight to compare for the Revolutionary Army because we actually see a lot of this amongst the commanders. We already covered Bello Betty, but let's talk about Lindbergh, the scientific support archetype that has a jetpack, which is one of the wind connections I mentioned earlier. But in his debut, he revealed the Cool Shooter, which is essentially a freeze ray that stops people from moving and attacking. But it doesn't stop there. Let's look at Karasu, the guy who looks like he just absolutely destroys everyone and everything that looks at him because he's so cool. And he does, don't get me wrong, but let's not forget how we were introduced to him. First, he uses his Sut Logia power by providing his allies giant crow transportation, which was shown giving Sabo a ride in the sky, but also one of the coolest aspects of his powers is that he's able to provide his allies crow accessories, where Sabo wore his Sut as a glove and it served as a communication device. And I imagine Karasu is able to use this to eavesdrop on enemies and collect information, which is another aspect of a support role, which is information gathering and espionage. We do see that Karasu has more upfront attack capabilities in the sense that he did charge an admiral with his crows, but prior to that we see that he used his crows to disarm opponents. The potential of a Logia like his and how insane Logias can be, he decides to use it mostly in a support fashion. And this trend continues with Morley, who has the Push fruit. Despite being a giant who created level 5.5 in Impel Down and is the technical first person we know to escape Impel Down, Morley did it non-violently apparently and in secret. And on top of that, despite the large disposition and ability to literally move the earth, we've never seen Morley truly attack anyone. Morley used the power to help Sabo escape, which is utility, but also despite the very simple offensive capabilities of being able to bury someone 6 feet under, Morley usually used the power power to disrupt and create chaos for defensive benefits. And this support pattern doesn't just apply to current members, touching back on the information gathering. Given the Revolutionary Army's information network that we see that allows them to maintain communication across the world, we see Ginny, who as a child showed the ability to wiretap and gather information too. And I'm sure she had more merit to her value to the Revs that we never really got to cherish, but it was because our focal point was on Kuma, probably the most important character for this analysis. Of the commanders, Kuma's power is easily the most offensive ability, but it is in the hands of a literal pacifist. And though Kuma has the air cannon and compression powers that are used defensively, we see that primary usage of Kuma's fruit was shown to be the ability to transport people by teleporting them, which Kuma used this power to save the Straw Hats from an admiral. But arguably one of the most powerful support-like abilities in the story is the ability to deflect anything. This power can be used to protect and mitigate damage, but most importantly, Kuma can completely remove the pain, damage, and suffering that someone has, as depicted in Thriller Bark with Luffy as the test subject. At that point in the story, we saw Luffy push himself to the point where he acknowledged that he was going to have to be reckless to save his crew, and despite that, despite everything he put himself through, he woke up with no problem the next morning, completely fine, because Kuma has another one of the most broken support abilities, the ability to offset pain. If Kuma were a villain, he could even weaponize that pain, but because of his overbearingly good-natured soul, he simply takes the damage himself, which in of itself is a huge aspect of being a support role. The ability to tank and absorb damage, something that even without his powers, Kuma was willing to do due to his large body and ability to withstand more pain than others. The point being that from the bottom up, we see a trend in the Revolutionary Army that is pretty consistent, which is that every character, even when capable of more, will still elect themselves to a support position. All of their abilities, no matter how obscure, will find a utility use and become an immense tool for the true fire of the revolution at hand. And I think this is depicted perfectly at Marineford. I think it's no secret that despite Ace having the fire fruit, Luffy was the real spark for the opposition at Marineford. It was Luffy that on all sides of the rebellion was used as a symbol that literally lit the fire in every faction to unite. From defecting warlords like Boa to impel down prisoners like Crocodile to the entire Whitebeard pirate army, Luffy became the fire that needed fanning, and that is the role Ivankov played, along with many others, but initially Ivankov's prerogative was to make sure Luffy lived for Dragon's sake. But after Luffy threw himself into the war, Ivankov witnessed his selfless heroism and couldn't help but do more. In chapter 558, when Luffy began his trek towards Ace at Marineford, Kizaru immediately took aim at him, and it was Ivankov's intervention here where by blasting Luffy with a Deathwing, Eva helped Luffy dodge a Kizaru beam, to which even Luffy was grateful, and Eva proclaimed that it's just their duty to make him survive. But then we see it take a turn over the course of the events where Luffy's tenacity convinced Ivankov to actually betray his initial goal of having Luffy survive, and instead allowing Luffy to throw his life away now so that he could live without regret. And so Ivankov hit Luffy with another S-tier support move, the Energy Hormone Shot, that gave Luffy a literal second life. And after Luffy eventually used this buff to make it to Ace, and Ace had his eventual demise at the hands of Akainu, this was the only time when Ivankov demonstrated the next level support role responsibility to protect the carry, or in this metaphor, the flame, being Luffy. Had Luffy died, then all morale on all sides would have been smothered, and everyone would have treated this as a full loss. But Ivankov made sure that Luffy could survive by acting as a shield and stepping up to one of the strongest, if not the most actively destructive character, Admiral Akainu himself, and this allowed Luffy valuable time to escape. And so combing back through some of the points, we know how difficult the revolution can be, and we have seen how Oda has highlighted the Revolutionary Army's role in successfully overcoming the difficulty. It's through support, but most importantly, sparking the flames of the revolution. We saw that highlighted between Monkey D. Dragon and Sabo. Dragon even commended the attitude, which was that despite Cobra becoming collateral damage, his death sparked a positive sentiment in the uprisings around the world, given his connection to the world government, and the attributed blame given to Sabo. And Sabo says in chapter 1083, "Well, I'm sorry to King Cobra, but this way suits me just fine. Anything that gets the flames of revolution burning." And that's why I say saved Sabo for now. He is the only character in the Revolutionary Army that has pure offensive capabilities. He is the one who countered Admiral Fujitora, for example, and it makes sense given his inheritance of the fiery Ace's fruit and theoretically his will, but I do think it's very interesting given his role at Meridjoa. The Revolutionary Army obviously went there to cause minimal casualties. They had 3 missions in mind: free Kuma, destroy the food reserves, and destroy the Celestial Hoof statue. And when we look at those missions, it was Sabo who used his fire offensively for the food reserves, while the other commanders ran interference. Rather than use Sabo offensively against the admirals, they had him do non-violent actions that ultimately were seen to declare war and cripple the other side without directly causing deaths. And despite the utmost effort in preventing Sabo from using his firepower for violence, it was the one violent action that wasn't even his fault that was used to fuel the flames of revolution. And the fallout created the reputation for Sabo that named him the Flame Emperor, which is counterintuitive to the entire operation, to the point that even Sabo cringed at being called that, which indicates even more so that Sabo also, despite wanting to claim Ace's fruit for sentimental reasons, has been operating in a way where he remains in a non-violent supportive role, thus allowing the flames that are personally involved with overturning their own lives and chasing their own freedoms to breathe. And that's ultimately the metaphor Oda has been playing with, right? Fire is an uncontrollable mess. It can easily become unmanageable. Let's take Roger, for example. Due to his circumstances, he didn't have much of an option, but as Rayleigh said, he was the bonfire that created the wildfire that spread throughout the world, that created the burning passion to become a pirate and find the One Piece. And maybe if Roger saw the consequences of his actions, he would have taken more responsibility, but he couldn't. His actions unintentionally sparked chaos for many places, especially, for example, Fishman Island. And had Whitebeard not protected the island by staking his name to it, it actually could be said that Roger's direct influence caused the mass enslavement of the Fishman race by recklessly encouraging lawless behavior. And it seems like Dragon has been playing with fire the entire story, carefully not to be burned and careful not to let the fire grow out of control too fast or radically. That could explain why we see a character who allows others to take the helm of their own destinies, but at the same time plays such an aloof character. And I think this directly contrasts Luffy, who does take it upon himself to undo the corruption in the world, but Luffy doesn't do it for the humanitarian reasons, which can be seen as noble, but in a lot of ways, Luffy is lucky that every single time he left a place, there was a competent person there who was able to clean up and provide proper guidance afterwards. Alabasta with Vivi, Skypiea with Gonfall, Fishman Island had a few support beams, Dressrosa with King Riku, and Wano with Momo. But even in that situation, Yamato had taken the responsibility of staying back and playing defense while Luffy continued pushing forward. In other words, Dragon is trying to achieve much of the same thing, but is trying to be responsible for the fallout. And so then if we can understand that, then it makes sense that just like the rest of his organization and every character underneath him, even offensively leaning characters, Monkey D. Dragon is most likely a character whose power will be used in a supportive role rather than an offensive role. So it may be that Dragon wields incredible power, much like Kuma, but the primary way he uses his power is by being the ultimate fan to the revolutionary flame, which is why Oda has given him wind-based powers, despite us already covering how unclear what source that wind is. Is it Haki? Is it a devil fruit? Or is it some kind of sorcery, completely separate to all of this, and magical like what Saturn showed, or scientific like what Watheria showed? The overall point is that however Dragon manifests that wind, I am more than confident that he will have the same profile as a support character, which may sound so lame to a lot of people, but anyone with game balancing knowledge knows that any support character that ends up getting overtuned stats like Law has with the Opi Opi no Mi ends up becoming one of the most powerful characters instantly. I mean, we know that Dragon has enough wind power to essentially subjugate an entire island temporarily. We know that from Ivankov, who witnessed Luffy's vitality, that Dragon is likely to be just as tenacious. We know that when Luffy debuted his Conqueror's Haki, Ivankov said the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and that this is the power that explains why people are so drawn to him. I think it might make sense that if you were to combine all of the aspects of power within the Revolutionary Army, you might get a character like Dragon, an incredibly durable tank like Kuma that allows them to protect, an incredible orator whose words give people belief in their cause like Bello Betty, which is why we see such a devoted organization in the first place. We know to a certain extent Dragon is a weapons expert given Kuma's comments in chapter 1099 1996, so maybe a lot of Lindbergh's science and methodology is reflected within Dragon's own arsenal. And we know that as far as offensive capabilities goes, the one thing we know to expect is a dragon breath-like ability that we saw from Sabo. But I wouldn't be surprised that like Robin was able to learn Fishman karate, that Dragon also knows these abilities too, which I'll cover in another video. But the overall point is that I think when we eventually get Dragon revealed to us in full form, we will see that he is restricted from our perspective. He will have immense power and capability, but use his maximum effort to protect all lives. Not necessarily because he is afraid to kill, but maybe because it's much easier to kill and harder to protect somebody. And this would be the major contrast to Admiral Akainu, who sees life as disposable the moment it breaks a rule, makes a mistake, or God forbid, exists within an obviously broken system that favors the people who writes the rules, but not the people who have to live by them. But one teaser for the Dragon power-centric video that ties a lot of this together is that I think that Dragon might be a master in the breath of all things. Given that there is such a huge focus on wind and air within the revolutionaries, I think that making the Supreme Commander fully aware of all living things and able to sense the core essence of an object or person makes a lot of sense. And since Sabo demonstrated the core sensibility in Dressrosa, I wouldn't be surprised if he learned how to train this from Dragon. And I'll do a deeper dive of that as I mentioned, but for now the connecting part is that the idea that Dragon has an ability that makes him extra sensitive to the value of life, which is what drives him so much. And I thought about how Rayleigh said that Luffy seems to have an extremely sensitive sense for other people's emotions, noting that it was probably unconscious, which is similar to how when Luffy unlocked Conqueror's Haki, Ivankov said that Luffy was not conscious of the power and that it was similar to Dragon. So I think it makes sense to think that Dragon has the full access to that power. To clarify, in One Piece we have had a subset of observational Haki tied to emotional sense, and interestingly, a lot of the revolutionary-like characters that were anti-violence shared the same skill. Otahime being the one light that tried to bring the Fishman people to the sun, she demonstrated the ability to sympathize and emotional sense the heart of a Fishman thief, and hear the cries and screams of Fisher Tiger's heart. Another strong example in my opinion is Fujitora, the one admiral who has brazenly acted in complete counter to his fleet admiral's commands, who is able to sense the true emotions of the citizens of Dressrosa. So I think it makes sense that Dragon has the final form of those powers combined, allowing him to understand people's true intentions very accurately, which is probably how he was able to even recruit such good-natured crewmates that were able to withstand the difficulties of being a Revolutionary Army member. And it would accumulate to the point that I think the best example of what Dragon will show is the same thing that Kobe demonstrated at Marineford, a sort of life sense, being able to track the lives lost, and thus would make sense based off of what we've seen of Dragon being so far from much of the conflict. Again, I don't think he'll be crippled by this as Marineford Kobe was, but I do think this will play a role in shaping his character, being able to empathize like Kobe was, internally feeling the sadness and the pain that war brings, which would fit his pacifistic nature that was alluded to by Vegapunk. It might even be the scene we see of Kobe at Marineford is going to be mirrored in Dragon's flashback, and might be the reason why he left the Marines at such a young age. But let's come back to what you came here for, Dragon's powers. As I was saying before, I believe he will demonstrate extreme emotion sense. Now we have no idea what a final level of this power looks like, but the other side of this is that even for a non-combative power like Otahime, just with this emotion sense, she was able to dodge bullets. Fujitora is blind and is yet able to see every citizen's emotions in a parade of people. Kobe has climbed beyond everyone's expectations in and outside of the story, with just observation Haki being one of his touted foundational powers. And again, I believe that all of these powers actually connect to nature, the natural state of people, objects, living things. Hence why I think Breath of All Things is connected to Dragon, despite us not having it connected in the story. And I think all this technically connects to the weird observational Haki-like power that Nami has regarding the weather. She's able to sense the weather with her body, as Vivi said it early on. But it's actually funny because Nami is the first character to sense the essence of Dragon in Logtown via the barometric pressure. And I think it's because Dragon will be shown to have that same power, or rather that this is the true essence of all the powers mentioned before. And the reason why I think that is because of Fujitora. If you remember, he stated with that same crazy observational Haki that he has, he is able to ascertain the manner of clouds above, but then cheekily humbles heals himself in old age and says perhaps these bones are growing old, which ties to Nami being able to sense the weather with her body. Anyways, I will deep dive more of Dragon's power specifically later. I want to focus on the support aspect first. Specifically, I want to tell you why I believe Dragon will be known or aptly called a mystical human. It's actually because of the same connection between him and Nami. Nami was able to sense what we know to be Dragon's presence or area effect that keeps being connected to him via the barometric or atmospheric pressure change. Now, I know that we keep tying Dragon to wind, but Oda actually included the specific mechanic here of the pressure and temperature dropping at Logtown. Now, this might sound technical, but if any of you spend a few weeks watching the Weather Channel like I did as a kid, then you start to pick up that when there's a pressure drop and temperature drop, that means it's a cold front that invites higher pressure and warmer air to push into the cold zone. Usually this comes from the oceans, and that's how you get wind and cloudy skies, and the more severe it is, the rush of air and pressure creates the conditions for thunderstorms or hurricanes. Now, I don't want to act like a weather wizard here, but this is probably the same case as what happened in the Gray Terminal instance too. As we see before the fire starts, the citizens note that the wind is picking up, hence the signaling that Dragon would show up there too. It even has the signature lines crossing the panel like at Logtown, and if Dragon were simply just wind power, when there's a blast of air that saved the citizens from the engulfing flames, if anyone knows how wind works with a wildfire, it makes it worse and stronger. You're literally fanning the flames, but in this case the flames were snuffed and the people did not mention wind but rather an explosion. And let's say there was wind so strong that it was able to snuff out the fire like this, then wouldn't it take the people away too? And so even in this instance, there's some interesting mechanics that seem related to atmospheric pressure rather than simply wind. And I'll make a better case for this next time because we don't have the time for that right now. The reason why Dragon is a mystifying character is actually connected to two things. It's Nami and Baltigo. So because Nami is technically the first person to sense Dragon, and I think Dragon is going to have a similar disposition as she does as far as weather goes, and it was via barometric pressure, let's take a look at how Nami has used barometric pressure. In chapter 192, Nami debuted a power using the high atmospheric pressure of Alabasta and actually disrupted the atmospheric pressure and created mirages using strong winds. Yes, mirages. At chapter 411, we see Nami uses the mirage again in her fight against Khalifa, which she justifies by saying she created by weaving cold air and taking control of the climate of the room via the pressure and temperature. And so to summarize, this is essentially how mirages work. In fact, the move called Fata Morgana that Nami uses is the actual name for the optical illusions that frighten sailors. Fata Morgana essentially translating to illusion fairy, or more literally Morgan the Fairy, an allusion to the King Arthur tales. But to explain how it works, basically by creating layers of different pressurized air, you could create illusions, or in the natural setting, the gap between cold air and hot air, depending on the disparity between the temperatures, you create a duct that bends light, thus creating the illusions. And oftentimes this phenomenon can be connected to a fog or mist-like illusion. Thus why I think Dragon is going to be a mystical character. But jokes aside, given Oda is huge on sailor lore, and this is a pirating story, and he included the real folklore of the Flying Dutchman, which was realistically explained away by the Fata Morgana phenomenon that would make it appear that a ship sailing the seas could be perceived to be in the sky due to the mirage occurring. And I think it would make a lot of sense that since Nami is manipulating this via the same mechanics that Dragon seems to be able to control like it's his own body, to the point that people think he is a Logia, then it might be perfect to say that one of Dragon's most important support powers is literally multiplying someone like Nami did. But more than anything, this sounds like pure headcanon, but this could be the explanation for Baltigo as well, the headquarters of the revolutionary army that the world government and the world never could find, or rather what Burgess said, nobody knew about. We've covered how significant this line is before, but the only way to find this island was via his Viver card. Other than that, it was shrouded in mystery, and what I think is that it was literally shrouded in some sort of mist or mirage. See, of the little we know of the island, we know that it looks pure white and it has the same wind lines that we see when Dragon is present in all the other places, which means that the same air phenomenon that happened at Logtown and Gray Terminal is happening here. But there's one big difference. The wind is here, but the skies are relatively clear, which would imply that it's reversed here and that the storms, clouds, and most likely mirages are probably surrounding the island. Nami created the mirages by manipulating the pressure, and if storms rolled into Logtown due to a pressure drop, then if Dragon or someone simply maintained a high pressure zone, then the island would be defended by natural forces, kind of like Wano in chapter 910. We see how much of a deterrent the waves and storms were there, but now imagine a dragon level storm. But most importantly, a mirage on top of everything else, essentially making the island invisible to anyone who approaches. Unless you have a Weaver card, which is what Burgess had, that would essentially help guide you through the fog of war. And so like Nami was saying, as they got closer to Wano, the wind got stronger, and essentially the difficulty kept increasing. And I think that is how Dragon has defended and protected Baltigo this entire time, thus tying his support power to the wind power that we've seen of him, to how wind has been used by Nami, the weather expert, and most importantly, this would explain why Dragon's presence was so sparingly spread throughout the entire story. See, it's crazy to me that Dragon has been operating the oceans as the world's worst criminal so effectively that not only did we see an early on Dragon able to sail the seas and seems to be able to go places without any hitch, but also they didn't even have a clue where his headquarters was and has been in a single spot for over 20 years. So if Dragon had a stealth-like ability that allowed him to be mobilized without any worry of being pursued, then this would explain a lot, but also would explain why in our One Piece timeline we've almost never seen Dragon move. Logtown is basically the only time he had left, but if the entire reason why he hasn't been able to be more active is because he has to stay in Baltigo to maintain the shield and the illusion for Baltigo to remain safe, then we have answered a huge question of why Dragon could be so incredibly strong yet unable to move on his own. Because a lot of people forget that he houses the refugees of the nations he is starting a revolution for. We see this in the army of children he's raising that Sabo was a part of. We see this in the people he saved from Great Terminal. We see this implied by the people Sabo saved from Lelucia. Dragon is responsible for the freedom of all these people, and we know that he is super protective. He said children are a vulnerability for any parent, and we know that despite Dragon being the most wanted man, he visited Luffy at least 3 times, the time when Kuma and Dragon went there and Kuma figured things out, Great Terminal, and Logtown. And Ivankov figured that Dragon always faced east, realizing later that it was because Luffy was in the East Blue. So I wonder how protective Dragon would be of Sabo, Koala, and all the kids he is directly responsible for when they were children, especially on Baltigo. The idea that Dragon was single-handedly the reason why the world never knew Baltigo existed due to Dragon's power, and in order to maintain that he had to remain there, and on top of that, if his protections were a storm and a mirage, that would mean that he had small windows of time while the storm subsides that he could leave. And adding the emotional sense I mentioned before, that could explain how despite the Blackbeard Pirates and CP0 apparently surprising the Revs, they managed to escape both without a single casualty. All of this making Dragon an actual legendary character, using the powers we know he has and applying the pacifistic disposition that he probably will have given the Revolutionary Army. Because remember, Kuma traveled the entire world and saw tragedies unfold and constantly asked himself what Dragon would do. And Kuma is our benchmark for being a kind, gentle soul. But that didn't stop him from succeeding in all of their revolutionary activities. In fact, Kuma was claimed to be the hero of Sorbet Kingdom, but in reality, originally Kuma failed to free his nation through his own immense power. And Dragon arrived and succeeded in almost every aspect that Kuma failed. And I have to think that Dragon did in a way that Kuma respected. And if Kuma failed to free his nation because he was too kind or gentle, and yet Dragon succeeded and Kuma saw that and decided to leave with him, it had to be in a way that Kuma approved of. And so, though I didn't give you the meta discussion surrounding what a character's power will be, and I didn't name Dragon's devil fruit for you, I hope this analysis on the Revolutionary Army that led me to a conclusion about Dragon's power profile as a character and why it's meaningful for the story was something you enjoyed. I hope to get the specific Dragon power video out very soon, but I do want to thank everyone for being so patient with my health situation and life and so supportive on streams and in videos. Honestly, sometimes I feel like the old people from Sorbet Kingdom that had their pain taken away by the benevolent Kuma, all thanks to everyone who supports me. And at the same time, you guys are the wind to my fire, the pressure that brings the storm. And so just like how Dragon is making changes throughout the world, everyone who watches, likes the video, and shares it all change my world too. And all I can offer you is the view of my vision. And I hope this time it gave you some interesting insight on the mystifying, mystical, mystery character shrouded in mist named Monkey D. Dragon. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next Parvision.